Good morning. My name is Sarah Bunn, and I'm the Multifamily Workforce Housing and Engagement Manager. Welcome to the 2022 virtual Multifamily RFP Kickoff. This year, based on external feedback from last year, we have turned this into a two-day event. Day one, which was yesterday, we focused on emerging developers and those that are new to the Minnesota Housing Consolidated RFP. We had great responses to day one. If you are interested in listening to that presentation or would like to share it with others, the recording will be posted on our website very shortly. Today, which is day two, we will be focusing on the multifamily consolidated RFP updates. So you will hear from multifamily staff on topics that are either new this year or areas we want to emphasize as you start to consider multifamily proposals and applications for the 2022-2023 RFP HTC Round 1. As most of you are aware, this is the second year of a two-year QAP, so we do not have significant changes to announce this year. Based on attendee feedback from last year, we did push back the timeline of the kickoff this year to align with the publishing of the RFP. So hopefully all of you are excited about that. Please use this time to ask specific questions on the RFP materials or checklist items. Today's presentation will run until approximately 11:40. And then at 11:45, we'll be able to join the question and answer breakout sessions on each of the topics that will be led by staff. We will post a recorded version of today's webinar on our website following the kickoff. So if you do miss any of it or need to share it, that will be available as well. And then a survey will be sent at a later date requesting feedback on your experience with today's virtual kickoff. Thank you in advance for providing feedback for us so that we may continue to structure the kickoff responsibly. Thank you for those external partners in attendance with us today. We look forward to being able to be in person again, hopefully next year. But we are certainly grateful to be able to connect virtually with all of you. I also want to extend appreciation to the Minnesota Housing team who have prepared today's content to be able to engage with you as we start the technical assistance season and you work to develop your project proposals. Next slide, please. Minnesota Housing provides access to safe, decent, and affordable housing and builds stronger communities across the state. Minnesota Housing offers products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and to stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. It also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both financing and long-term asset management. And it has pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. Next slide, please. There will be question and answer breakout sessions, as I mentioned, that run concurrently at the end of the presentation on each topic. These breakouts are intended to allow time with staff to answer questions that you may have on the presented topics or application materials. Please reserve your questions for those breakout sessions. During the main session, you can type your questions into the question chat feature of the GoToWebinar at any time. However, any questions typed into the chat or question box during the main session will be saved and staff will get back to you after the event. Next slide, please. We encourage you to request technical assistance using our technical assistance request form available on the application resources section of the multifamily webpage, and you will be connected with a staff person. Minnesota Housing receives many requests for technical assistance, so please complete this form as thoroughly as possible. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Minnesota Housing's Commissioner, Jennifer Ho.
See if I have all the right buttons pushed. Thanks, Sarah. Boy, I long to do these things in person again soon, too. Just looking at the numbers, I can imagine the faces of our partners out there, and also echo Sarah's just nod to the team members. It is amazing what it is that we have been able to accomplish during these pandemic times. Just as I begin, I just want to start by saying, as the commissioner of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, I want to acknowledge that in Minnesota, state government works in partnership with 7 Anishinaabe tribal governments and 4 Dakota tribal governments. Minnesota Makoche has been the homeland of the Dakota and Anishinaabe people for thousands of years. The state of Minnesota is on stolen land where the U.S. government carried out genocide, forced removal, and ethnic cleansing in order to acquire land. When Minnesota was declared a U.S. territory in 1849 and a state in 1858, it was at the expense of Native people, their lives, their homes, and their land. Therefore, as the Commissioner of Minnesota Housing, I owe it to all Native peoples who live here to consider ways that my agency can invest in housing stability and a better future for their families and communities. I owe it to the 11 sovereign nations to be a humble partner and seek ways to assist them in meeting the housing needs of their members and their communities. As the leader of my agency, I am committed to continuing to push myself and my team to do more and to do better to repair past harms and to support the resilience and the flourishing of our Native neighbors. I also just want to appreciate that all of our partners are focused on providing housing opportunities that the private market doesn't support, and really appreciate that for all the communities that you serve, we couldn't do a thing without those of you who are in attendance today. So I got a lot of gratitude for the work that you do. James said he acknowledged all the hard stuff yesterday, so that I shouldn't have to spend a lot of time talking about that, but I will just say this feels like kind of the last third of a Star Wars movie where just about everything is stacked against us in terms of what we're trying to make happen, which is the simple miracle of housing in Minnesota. And you know, I always believed that every project of preservation or new construction was miraculous, and it just seems like it's miraculous times 10 these days with everything that's going on, market forces, workforce conditions, just the fact that the housing shortage has only continued to accelerate the rising cost of housing that's been exacerbated in so many ways. So thank you for your perseverance. Thanks for wanting to do another project. We're at a really unique moment up at the Capitol. And, you know, the legislature is supposed to finish their job on May 23rd, knocking wood. Getting done on time doesn't seem to be a virtue that is readily apparent there all the time. But May 23rd is the technical deadline for having all the budget bills and policy bills done. And there is a lot of money on the table. At $50 million, the Senate target is the largest for housing of any target that they have over in the Senate. So I guess that's a starting point. We have $1 billion on the table in the House for housing and homelessness. I have been up there. I have said my piece to any committee that would hear me, but I can't close this deal and bring in the types of capital resources that we need to say yes to more of what you do without your help. And so this is showtime. This is when you, your leadership, your board, anybody that makes sense gets on the phone and calls the Senate and House leadership, the committee chairs, any members of the committee where you have housing operating in those jurisdictions, any member of the legislature to make the case that an investment of $1 billion on housing and homelessness programs, whether it's through the housing infrastructure bonds, the public housing preservation general obligation bonds, or the many appropriated programs where we're seeking money, that all of those dollars translate to homes, which translates to better lives for the people who live there. And you can make those stories real because you work with those residents. You have seen the value of preservation projects to improve the feel of communities. You have seen what a new development has meant to a neighborhood. You understand that your residents, many of them are working members of communities. You understand that they're parents with kids who can enjoy going to the same school from the beginning to the end of the school year. You can appreciate that for people who are seniors or people with disabilities or people who have had experiences living on the streets, that the fact of a safe and stable home that someone can afford is pure peace of mind, and the opportunity to not have that stress and strain. We've been under so much stress and strain with the pandemic and the economic impacts and everything else that's going on in our country and on the planet, that the peace of mind of home, nothing really can beat that. I'm doing everything in my power to make sure that we come out of the legislative session with the funding to meet the moment of rising costs, to meet the moment of the need to address the supply issues, to meet the moment of making sure that we're providing housing for folks at the lowest income levels. So if you guys help me go big at the Capitol, Minnesota Housing will be here to help you realize your miraculous aspirations to do more housing in these challenging times. So with that, I'll turn it over to my team, who handles all the miracles of the details of the financing and all the complexities and all the opportunities that come with that. Sorry, my phone always rings in the middle of these things. And it's my great pleasure, and this is just one of the things I was wishing that I was able to do in person. It's my great pleasure to hand the screen over to Summer Jefferson. Summer's continued leadership in the agency has just been a shining light, a joy to work with, just a tremendous mastery of the detail, but also just the character and style that just, makes you want to do hard things. So Summer, I don't know if you're out there, but just want to thank you for your leadership in the space. I hope I made you blush a little there, and show's all yours.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate it so much. So thank you so much. Good to see you. Thank you, Commissioner Ho, for your remarks and kind of providing a legislative update and acknowledging the complex issues that are impacting the affordable housing industry in the state of Minnesota and just across the nation. So good morning, everyone. My name is Summer Jefferson. I am the manager for the programs team in multifamily. Our team oversees the consolidated RFP process and also a number of the state and federal programs that are included in the RFP, including housing tax credits and housing infrastructure bonds and federal programs like HOME and Nhtf, a National Housing Trust Fund. So we are pleased to be able to hold this event with you this year. It is amazing that we are having this again virtually, but we do hope to see some of you all in the next year as many things are beginning to take place in person. This time of year is definitely an exciting time at the agency as it is a milestone to mark the initial culmination of so much great work and coordination with all of you. And it makes funding available to help build and preserve homes that are affordable in communities throughout Minnesota. So I want to take this opportunity to say a thank you to the Minnesota Housing team for all of the work that you've done thus far and all of the work that is still to come. And I also want to thank all of you for attending today. We appreciate your continued participation and your partnership in this process. So, and then as Sarah mentioned, we have changed the configuration this year based upon your feedback. Our strategy is to break out some of the details and the content into separate webinars and training opportunities. So most of the content-heavy RFP training that you usually see on this day were already covered in our day one session, where we discussed an introduction to the RFP, housing tax credits, an introduction to housing infrastructure bonds, our underwriting standards, and supportive housing. We will also offer separate detailed scoring wizard and self-scoring worksheet training in the next couple of weeks. So our focus today is to emphasize what has changed, what's been updated, and what is new. Essentially, what are the most relevant items to keep in mind? Our intent is to provide you with the most pertinent information that will help you as you start to develop your applications. So I will briefly walk through some of the upcoming important dates that to keep in mind. I'll kind of discuss the multifamily selection framework and the balance of funding factors that we use for selection. And then finally, I will highlight a few updates and improvements related to the RFP. Next slide, please. So here's a look at this year's timeline. So the 2022 RFP timeline will be similar to last year's. This timing has worked out really well to help us accommodate for any significant policy changes, such as the QAP, our scoring, or our process changes. It is also allows our internal and external staff and stakeholders the time to kind of consider any of those potential changes that the commissioner mentioned from the legislature. So the 2022 Consolidated RFP is now open for applications. We released the application and materials on April 13th, and this includes our checklist items, all of our tools, forms, instructions, our program guides, and standards. So all of those documents are available on our website and are in the funding round in our multifamily customer portal. Pre-applications for innovative construction techniques and our Section 811 project-based rental assistance are due in a couple of weeks on April 28th in the portal. And then at that point, Minnesota Housing will review pre-applications and then inform applicants of their status on May 5th. The intent to apply, or what we call the ITA, is due on May 19th. And the ITA kind of lets us know that you're interested in applying, and it provides some preliminary characteristics and information about your project. There will no longer be checklist items in the portal for the intent to apply. We did change this last year based upon your feedback. So this deadline really now focuses on spinning up a project in the portal and identifying the project characteristics and other data points for information sharing. One change to note from last year is that this is a hard deadline. So all of the projects must submit the ITA by May 19th in order to be eligible to submit a full application. And then finally, the full application is due in July again on the 14th. And that includes site control, qualification forms, and all of the financials. The majority of that application will be submitted via the multifamily customer portal, but we did make one process change this year to remove the qualification forms from the portal. So all of the forms and schedules A through E will be submitted via the multifamily secure upload tool. This was a modification I think that we included last year, thinking that it might be easier for everyone to just upload everything into the portal in one location. However, what we saw is that it became more of a challenge for applicants to kind of enter the form from various times into multiple projects. So I think this is a great example that we are always looking for minor and major changes to improve the process. And that it can also include a change back to a prior process that proved to be a bit more efficient. And then final funding recommendations for selections will be submitted at Minnesota Housing December board meeting. So, and I know we have had a number of questions whether we were permanently be moving that to January, but that was hopefully just a one-time event. December is our preferred timeline. One last, please just remember that the deadlines are a time and a date. So submission deadlines are at noon and the system will lock down automatically at that time. So turning to one of the areas that we've received most questions about is how we make our selection decisions. So I really wanted to spend a little bit more time this year focusing and discussing the multifamily selection framework and the principles. So you may have spent a fair amount of time gathering information about our scoring policies and our requirements. As we all know, the RFP is very competitive, so a project score does matter, but it isn't the only selection factor that Minnesota Housing will use in order to select projects. A lot of this information is incorporated into our multifamily application instructions for the Consolidated RFP, so it does outline several components related to the selection process. These include, but are not limited to, reviewing the project's eligibility, including a review of the housing type and project type, the housing activity, and how the project aligns with the available resources for Minnesota Housing or our funding partners. Project feasibility, which ranges from an analysis of the architectural schematics and components to the population served in relation to the market and the community. We analyze the organizational and financial capacity to determine if the project team is can successfully close and manage the project for the long term. We also do a review of the project compared to the strategic and selection priorities outlined in the QAP and Minnesota Housing Strategic Plan in our self-scoring worksheet. So all the applications are scored according to the priorities contained in the worksheet and then ranked based upon that score. Deferred loan funding priorities. This is another area that we really take a look at. So this is a review of how the project compares to the deferred funding priorities or requirements of each of the specific programs. So not all deferred funds are created equal. It is the RFP is an opportunity for you to apply for multiple funding sources, but those funding sources have different requirements attached to them. So there are some limitations that impact project type, geographic location, and distribution. There are also preferences or set-asides. So all of these things kind of dictate the type of funding that the project can actually qualify for. And I'll talk a little bit more about this a little later. So then finally, we also look at, we analyze the project to make sure the project is compatible with our underwriting and design standards. And then we finally look at available funding, the geographic balance across the state, and then project type. Next slide, please. So this is a visual representation of the multifamily selection framework and how projects are ranked, reviewed, and selected. I think it is a true representation of how we balance the various funding principles and factors. It's definitely an art and not necessarily a science, but we've kind of summarized the selection frameworks into 4 major areas. The first is geographic balance. So the agency works to generally achieve geographic balance both between projects located in the metropolitan area and in the greater Minnesota. Within the metro, to balance between projects in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then also in the suburban communities, and in greater Minnesota to fund projects in as many regions of the state as possible. So this balancing also takes into account the locations of prior awards. The second area is project score and strategic priorities. I think we utilize the agency awarded points here. The third area is application type, financing, and financing structure. Essentially, many of you know that you can submit a dual application, and that provides more opportunities for the agency to fund your project. However, tax-exempt bonds allocated by the agency are in very high demand and are used across all project types, including HIBs. And then the last factor is available funds by project type. So you will hear more about some of the resources that we anticipate having in this RFP. We are very grateful that we live in a state that has prioritized affordable housing, affordable rental housing, but as we see across the country, the need is still outpacing our resources. So all of the agency sources offered in the Consolidated RFP are oversubscribed, and that is generally 4 to 1. And so given the resource constraints and the underwriting standards, the agency is not always able to solve the entire gap for each of the selected projects. Next slide. Then one area I just really wanted to emphasize and focus on is the overlap of the funding possibilities based upon the project type. So this slide looks at the type of funding that is available based upon each of the available funding sources in the RFP. We have also included the number of application requests and the number selected in the 2021 RFP as an example. So although we have a number of funding sources, we are limited in what projects get funded based upon the statutory requirements that include specific uses or restrictions for the projects. This available funding increases the sources available and correlates to a higher chance of selection. So for example, for permanent supportive housing projects, 100% supportive housing are eligible for probably the largest number of resources. This includes 2 of the larger funding sources, housing tax credits and housing infrastructure bonds. So this gives those projects a higher chance of being selected. And if you look at the 2021 RFP, 4 out of the 6 applications submitted were actually selected. Another example is just, I also wanted to just highlight workforce. At 59% of the applications last year, these projects represent the highest number of applications that we generally see. This is also the project type with the largest number of selected projects last year. But interestingly enough, it is also the project type with the lowest number of deferred resources available. So if you look at the slide at home and challenge available in our last RFP, they only represent 10% of the available deferred funds that we awarded or that we had available. So this makes it harder for us to flip projects to deferred, workforce projects to deferred only or deferred with a 4% structure. Even with the first mortgage, other sources, and syndication proceeds, the gaps still end up being approximately $6 to $9 million. So some too large to fill with some of the workforce housing deferred funding sources. The agency really realizes the demand and the limitation for this project type, and our strategy has been to flip other projects so that we can utilize as many 9% tax credits as possible. In fact, 8 out of the 10 workforce projects that we did last year were selected with 9% credits. However, 9% credits are not always a viable option for projects that are in certain locations. For example, a large number of the workforce projects that we receive are in the metro and are located in suballocated jurisdictions, which means that they're actually not really eligible to apply to the agency for the general pool of 9% tax credits. So a project would only be able to apply if they are a nonprofit via the nonprofit set aside. And so really for a for-profit workforce project in those locations, they would only be eligible to flip to a dual application and compete for the home or challenge funds. Hopefully this sheds a little bit more light on some of the funding considerations and how we kind of balance a large variety of funding factors. Next slide. But then the last area that I just briefly want to highlight is just some of the RFP improvements from this year. One of the areas that we received a lot of feedback consistently is concerning the complexity of the RFP process. While this industry and the work that we do can be complicated, streamlining and process improvement continues to be our priority. And the agency is committed to exploring ways to streamline, simplify, and modify our processes. So we look at this as an ongoing process and look for opportunities to continue improvement on an annual basis. And And a large number of our priorities are based upon the feedback that we receive from all of you. So we really appreciate that. One of the major changes that I wanted to highlight is just obviously our 2-year QAP. I think Sarah mentioned it in the introduction. The 2-year QAP provides a 2-year outlook and what the priorities and policies are for the agency. We also realize that the annual changes in our forms, our documents, our processes, our materials, that also adds another layer of complexity along with all the scoring policy changes that we were doing annually. So what we did is we looked to leverage the 2-year QAP and that 2-year outlook into all of our RFP resources and materials this year. So hopefully you will have noticed, or you will notice, that many of the forms, the documents, and the guides are the same. We really just looked for ways that we could streamline or clarify, combine. But if that wasn't there, then we didn't make a ton of substantial changes. And thinking that consistency is kind of one of our themes for this second year of the QAP. So we continue to explore additional resources to help with technical assistance. The kickoff, we have online trainings, our tutorials, our debriefings, technical assistance. And then this year, we will continue the 2 live external scoring wizard and scoring trainings to cover the significant scorings that went into effect last year. Finally, one of the major changes that we will continue to examine and always modify annually are updates to our technology. This is an area that I am always excited about, just acknowledging the strides that we have, that I've seen in my time at the agency. And we've just been able to make new enhancements, and we've updated based upon your feedback. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen Wilbright to talk more about our portal and technology updates.
Good morning. I'm Karen Wilbright, and I work on the business operations team at Minnesota Housing. Today, I'm going to highlight a couple of updates to our multifamily customer portal, commonly referred to as the portal, and our multifamily workbook. I'll also remind you about upcoming training opportunities and resources. Next slide, please. As Summer mentioned, the portal is the online tool you'll use to submit application materials and complete your self-scoring worksheet. If you're new to working with Minnesota Housing or have changed organizations since your last login, please request a user account. You can find a request form on our portal resources page, which I link to on the next slide. Each year, we send out a survey after the completion of the Consolidated RFP to gather feedback about our processes, systems, and tools. Based on your feedback, we recently rolled out several changes in the portal. These include enhancements to our scoring wizard, additional email notifications, and adding a withdraw button to the project page layout. In the scoring wizard, we added additional on-screen guidance to clarify definitions, and it added an option for customers to elect fewer points than they are eligible for categories such as financial readiness, other contributions, and intermediary costs. In addition to the on-screen confirmation that already existed, we added email notifications to confirm the creation of your project and the submission of your score sheet. For those that create a project prior to the intend to apply deadline, but decide not to move forward with the submission of a full application, we added a withdraw button to allow you to withdraw your project within the system. To learn more about these changes, please register for the Scoring Wizard training on April 27th. I have more information on the training on my next slide. The multifamily workbook is an Excel-based tool used to collect and analyze project-specific data for applicants seeking funds from Minnesota Housing. Each year, we release a new version of the workbook that must be used if applying in the Consolidated RFP. The 2022 version, along with release notes, are available on our application resources page. Of note, this year we removed the custom print button that was on the summary tab in favor of using the default printing options in Excel. We also added additional rows in the development cost tab to capture park dedication fees and housing infrastructure bond fees. Next slide, please. Be sure to register for an upcoming portal training on April 27th. While the bulk of the training will focus on the scoring wizard, we'll also briefly cover topics such as what's new in the portal, how to create your project, manage your checklist, and share important reminders to avoid common mistakes. You can find registration information on our application resources page. A recording will be available for those that cannot attend. For more resources on the multifamily customer portal and support, visit the portal resources page linked on this slide, or contact us directly at mhfa.app@state.mn.us. Thank you. I'll now hand it over to Cody.
Thanks, Karen. Good morning. My name is Cody Thurman. I'm with Minnesota Housing's Planning and Research Division, and I maintain the geographic scoring criteria for the multifamily RFP. Since today's focus is on the current RFP, there's not a lot to update regarding geographic scoring. The categories remain the same as year one of the QAP, just with updated data. Please visit the community profiles page to see how your project will score under the current geographic scoring criteria. One item that is new with the 2-year QAP is that unfunded projects from last year, last RFP, are able to use their geographic scores for their sites from either last year or for the current round. You do not have the ability to mix and match scores from the last RFP and the current one. You must use the geographic scores from one year or the other. This change was made to really recognize the fact that many projects take multiple rounds to receive funding, as Summer alluded to in her kind of summary slide, and funding resources that are available. Again, I just want to reiterate that this only applies to projects that submitted an application and did not receive any award in the last round. If you are submitting a new project, you must use the current round geographic scores. Again, I recommend you visit the community profiles page. It's linked in multiple documents throughout the scoring process and in the portal as you are completing test scenarios as well. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Ashley Johnson with the Met Council.
Oh, thank you, Cody. I am Ashley Johnson, a housing planner at the Metropolitan Council, and I manage the Local Housing Incentives Account, or LHIA. For LHIA, we don't have any programmatic updates from last year. However, we do have 2 slides for you for background on LHIA. So the first gives an overview of who can receive LHIA funds, and the second lists our priorities. So LHIA is one of 4 community development grants administered by the Metropolitan Council under the state's Livable Communities Act, or LCA, adopted almost 30 years ago. And cities in the council's 7-county region can opt in to be an LCA participating community by adopting housing goals, which in turn allows those cities to apply for these grants. So LHIA is our only grant that is administered in partnership with Minnesota Housing to develop and preserve affordable rental and ownership housing, which includes multifamily and single-family development and preservation. And our funding is typically used as gap funding for hard project costs such as acquisition, site preparation, and site improvements. So in reference to our slide here, for us, the LCA participating city that the project is located in is the applicant to our grants, not the project developer. And counties can also be applicants as long as the project is in an LCA city. So therefore, our agreements, or our grant agreements, are technically between the municipalities and the Metropolitan Council. And this year we have 76 participating communities in the region. So for LHIA, we do require buy-in on behalf of the LCA community in the form of a dollar-for-dollar match. So this can come from sources like CDBG, home, and TIF funds. An exciting caveat is that we are attempting to try to change that local match, fingers crossed, in the legislature. And LHAA, oh, next slide, please. Thank you, Patty. So LHAA priorities have generally remained the same. So we prioritize projects that create or preserve affordability for people whose income or households whose income is at or below 30% of area median income, or AMI, for projects that provide larger family size units. We consider that to be units with 3 or more bedrooms, for projects that serve people experiencing long-term homelessness, and for projects that provide a diversity of housing choices or a housing type that isn't currently available within that project area. So LHA awards are announced about 1 to 2 weeks after Minnesota Housing's awards are. So we're looking potentially at January after the board meeting, the Minnesota Housing Board meeting in December. So again, no changes from last year, but we definitely wanted to come and give an overview again of LHIA. And we're excited to partner with Minnesota Housing this year again. And with that, I will pass it to Nicola Vienna.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Nicola Vienna. I'm the Housing Tax Credit Supervisor at Minnesota Housing. These updates will primarily be focused on the 9% housing tax credits. I'll use the acronym HTC. This refers to the Federal Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. In the annual consolidated RFP this year, we'll be allocating HTCs for 2023. That's why you see written in our language 2022 consolidated RFP, but then 2023 HTC because we forward allocate our credits. So per federal statute, 9% tax credits are allocated to states based on a formula where we look at the state population and a per capita amount. So the total HTCs available for the state for 2023 is 14.8 million. And for Minnesota Housing, our allocation is about $11 million. Minnesota Housing's annual 9% tax credit allocation has historically funded anywhere between 12 and 16 affordable housing projects representing 700 to 900 total units. Last RFP, Minnesota Housing selected 8 projects, 9% projects with 436 units. We have slightly less credits available to us than we did for the previous 4 years because a tax credit provision that was in place for 4 years where it allowed for a higher per capita amount has now expired and has not been renewed. Also, we saw higher requests for HTCs last RFP due to the increased construction costs. So that meant we couldn't select as many 9% HTCs last round. Each state receives a limited pool of 9% tax credits and it is a competitive resource in the RFP. We recommend applying as a dual application where you can apply for both 9% HTC and a 4% with deferred funding to give you more options for selection. Next slide, please. Statute also establishes Minnesota Housing as the primary allocating agency with a number of city and county sub-allocators. So we've got Minneapolis, St. Paul, Dakota, and Washington County all have their own allocations and a separate qualified allocation plan. Projects within these sub-allocator jurisdictions are encouraged to apply for HTCs directly through those sub-allocators. As Summer mentioned, projects in sub-allocator jurisdictions are not eligible to apply for the agency general pool of 9% tax credits. A project would only be able to apply if they are nonprofit and receive the nonprofit set aside. So Minnesota Housing will administer the HTCs for all areas outside the jurisdiction of sub-allocators. Next slide. So the IRS requires every HTC allocator to have a plan for allocating credits to developments, which is the Qualified Allocation Plan, the QAP. There are certain IRS and state requirements about what must be included in this plan, and Minnesota Housing is the largest allocator of HTCs for the state. So our QAP requires us to distribute the HTCs proportionately to the Metro and Greater Minnesota. So we have a Metro pool and a Greater Minnesota pool, which excludes the rural development already set aside of $375,000. So then we also in our QAP have set-asides. We've got set-asides for nonprofits, the nonprofit set-aside, one for the Metro and one for Greater Minnesota, as well as that rural development set-aside I just mentioned. All right, next slide. For the 2022-2023 qualified allocation plan, we converted to a 2-year QAP, as what was mentioned earlier. So that means we have no changes to the QAP document or the self-scoring worksheet. These documents are the same as last year. But please note we have updated the scoring guide with some clarifications. Remember, the scoring guide is the companion document to the self-scoring worksheet with a little bit more detail. We'll be offering training on the scoring wizard and the self-scoring worksheet in the coming weeks. Please watch for our e-news to register, and these dates and registration links are located now on our website on the applications resources page. So that is all I have for you for housing tax credits. I will turn it over to Summer Jefferson to cover housing infrastructure bonds.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Nicola. So I will be sharing a few updates on housing infrastructure bond program. And we use the acronym HIB. Next slide. I think Jennifer might have mentioned some of this, but just wanted to kind of talk about the governor's proposed budget. So I think there was a request of $250 million that has been made to the legislature. This is the largest request made since the program's inception. The current multifamily eligible uses for HIB are permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. This includes people with behavioral health needs. There is independent living for senior households 55 and older, and then preservation of projects with existing rental assistance. So proposed this year is also a new eligible use for new construction projects to households at or below 50% AMI. Next slide. So projects are categorized according to their eligible use and then ranked by score. The selection framework, which we discussed earlier, is then applied for HIB, and this kind of includes the selection priorities, the statutory preferences and requirements, geographic balance, and then feasibility. Next slide. So one of the most beneficial utilities of HIB is its flexibility. The amount of the funding that we receive allows us to consider the different financial structures, whether that would be, and those potential funding structures include HIB with volume cap, which is essentially deferred with a 4% structure. This is an HIB loan funded with volume limited bonds that qualify the project for 4% tax credits. This is the preferred structure when syndication proceeds make up a significant portion of capital sources. And then the second is deferred only. And so this structure kind of allows maximization of HIB resources, offsetting volume cap limitations, and then the loan may be repayable or forgivable. This type of this structure works well with sponsors that are a nonprofit or governmental entity. There is a potential for all HIB projects that are sponsored from a nonprofit or governmental entity to be evaluated under this structure. Next slide. So bond test analysis, all required to be submitted at application for all HIB eligible projects. So if the project is meeting the 50% test, this is determined to see if the project is meeting the 50% test to be eligible for the 4% tax credits. It also helps us to evaluate if the project, to determine if HIB is a good fit for the project and what the potential funding structure could be. It helps us to ensure that there are enough non-bond funded sources to cover bad costs, and then the impact of the deferred only structure for nonprofits and governmental entities, and evaluates if the project is meeting the 50% test for tax credits. We do recommend technical assistance. It's strongly encouraged, so please kind of work with the agency staff if you are completing this document. Next slide. So next I'll touch on the eligibility requirements for the different project types. For senior housing, all units in the project must serve seniors age 55 and older. You must submit a completed senior housing narrative. You must also provide access to services to residents and demonstrate the ability to increase physical supports and the supportive services as residents age and experience increasing levels of disability. A minimum threshold is that at least a part-time tenant service coordinator must be included. There's also HIB statutory selection preference priorities for senior housing that includes units that serve low-income seniors with incomes at or less than 30% of metropolitan area median. Next slide. HIB can also be used for permanent supportive housing. So if all of the units will provide permanent supportive housing for homeless households. And finally, HIB can be used to preserve existing federally assisted housing or critical affordable units with rent or income restrictions, as long as the projects meet a risk of loss under the preservation scoring criterion. I would say HIB is probably one of the most, because of the funding structures and because of the project types and eligible uses are probably the most complicated projects that we generally see. So I definitely would recommend reaching out to our staff for technical assistance if you're interested in pursuing an application. And with that, I will hand it over to Vicki Farden to talk about supportive housing updates.
Great, thanks, Summer. So I'm Vicki Farden, and I'm the Supportive Housing Policy Specialist at Minnesota Housing, and I'll cover some updates and tips for supportive housing applications. So first, for high priority homeless units, which is the highest priority household on the coordinated entry wait list for supportive housing, remember to review the criteria on the self-scoring worksheet for HPH points. There are some requirements for service staffing and funding commitment, which requires documentation to be submitted with your application. You'll need to have resources for rental assistance and services that will work for the population. So if you're planning to use housing support, long-term homeless eligibility, we just want you to be aware that some of the developments are periodically having difficulty filling their HPH units that also require long-term homelessness. In some of the smaller markets outside of the central metro area, there may not be enough qualified households on the coordinated entry wait list that meet the eligibility criteria or the household size for the unit at the time when there's an opening. So, and there's also a few larger communities in greater Minnesota that have enough inventory of LTH units to meet the need. So this is another reason why it's important to consult with the COC, the continuum of care, early in your planning process. You need to work with them to complete the COC confirmation form, which is required for all applicants with HPH units. So they expect that you'll present to their Continuum of Care Committee to review your project. And so you need to be mindful of their timelines. When their committees meet, they all meet at different times, depending on the region, and most of them are still meeting virtually, but some are now meeting in person. So this year we added information to the COC form to address some of the questions about the need for units in some areas and the resource fit for the population. So we added information that you need to complete about the unit types, the population served, and resources for rental assistance and services. And the COC will provide feedback to you on the market need for the units and the planned resources and provide that feedback to Minnesota Housing. So, oh, sorry, Patty, I forgot to tell you to advance that slide. So now on to the next slide, please. So for working with the county or Tribal Human Services Office, we're no longer requiring the Human Services confirmation letter for HPH units, but you do need to contact the county or Tribal Human Services early in the process of planning your supportive housing units. If you plan to use housing support for your HPH and or your units for people with disabilities, to share what you need for resources. And some counties do an RFP for housing support at certain times of the year, so you need to be mindful of that as well. So for the housing support commitment from the county, be sure to use our form, our confirmation form, which needs to be signed and completed by the Human Services Office, not by your service provider. And then if a service provider is committing tenant-based units to the project, would still need the confirmation form from Human Services so that they can verify that it's okay for that grantee, that contract holder, to use them for your specified units. And then you'll also need to work with the county if you're planning units to serve people with disabilities, which we call PWD units, to determine the population need, the referral process and services, and to complete the PWD narrative together. So some tips to keep in mind are that the PWD units are really intended for extremely low income people with disabilities who are not necessarily homeless. So if you plan to use LTH housing support for rented services, be aware of the market issues I mentioned earlier, and consider using regular housing support instead of LTH housing support. It's really a better fit for the intended population, but it doesn't come with the service rate. So many people with disabilities are already receiving mainstream services through the county, and there's a few other resources that you can use for services instead of the housing support service rate. And if you're planning to do a full supportive housing development and would like to receive HIB funding, remember that homeless eligibility is required for all units, and it's a very broad definition of homelessness. People can be coming from a variety of institutions and care, or any type of homeless situation, including people that might not be included in coordinated entry. So you'll need to clearly identify the populations, the referral sources, and services on the supportive housing narrative. Also consider if you'll take points to serve high priority homeless or persons with disabilities. There's an overlap of populations and eligibility criteria, but just remember to first consider the overall eligibility for HIB as homelessness, and then the eligibility for each of the specific unit types. So next slide. And I just want to remind you about our tenant selection plan guidelines that were revised in December 2020. Be sure to share that with your property manager so they're familiar with the requirements, especially the tenant screening criteria for all housing units, for housing and credit history and income requirements, and the additional criteria for supportive housing units for housing history, credit history, income requirements, as well as criminal history screening. So this applies to all consolidated RFP projects after March 2021 and for other applicable funding resources, which are shown on the linked document in the guidelines. For existing properties, the general considerations of the guidelines apply, and the new screening criteria are recommended best practices. So to help you write your TSPs after selection, we've developed a review checklist and help text for completing those to serve as a guide to verify that your TSP includes all the necessary components. And we also have a training tutorial on the tenant selection plan webpage. So now I'll pass it on to Ellie Miller for the A11 updates. So next slide.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ellie Miller, and I'm the program manager for the Section 811 program with Minnesota Housing. Section 811 PRA is project-based rental assistance that is available in this RFP for people with disabilities. Just as a note, the Section 811 is in a separate tier called Tier 2 on the self-scoring worksheet in the section for people with disabilities. And Tier 2 has a little different unit percentage and point breakout than Tier 1. Tier 2 offers a total of 13 points if 15% to 25% of the total units is used for people with disabilities using Section 811. Section 811 limits the total number of units. The total allowed in a project is 11 units, and no more than 25% of the total project can be used for supportive housing units, which includes your high priority homeless, and your people with disability units. This limit is important to consider for eligibility as it's a HUD rule. There is a pre-application that is required to determine eligibility for Section 811, and that pre-application is due April 28th. The pre-application is also important because you can determine your eligibility for Section 811 early to better plan for your supportive housing options. You will be notified by me no later than May 5th on your eligibility for Section 811. Later, as part of the standard application process, you will also be required to complete an 811 PWD narrative, which is signed by our partner representative at the Department of Human Services. Lastly, final approval for Section 811 funding is contingent on the project's selection for capital funding and Minnesota Housing completing a signed agreement with HUD. We can answer any additional questions you have in the supportive housing Q&A session later today. I would now like to hand it over to Erin Coons.
Thank you, Ellie. So good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Coons, and I'm an underwriter for the agency. Today, I'll be going over some general information regarding underwriting, as well as some updates for this year's RFP. Next slide, please. So our website is still the best place to get up-to-date information and any application resources. The two best tabs would be the application resources as well as the getting started tab at the top of the page. And then I want to direct you to the quick links on the left side of the page where you can find our most up-to-date underwriting standards, directions for the customer portal, as well as rent and income limits, and then program guides and materials. Next slide, please. So Patty, can you go back? Did it miss a slide? Okay, so you can go to the next slide. We still review our deferred awards as we have in the past prior years by first looking at the operating budget and making sure that rent and income expenses are in line with either prior year's operations or similar properties within our portfolio. We will also confirm that the rents proposed as well as the restrictions are achievable. From there, we will review the development budget, making sure contingencies, developer fee, both upfront and deferred, and then bond and low fees, as well as appropriate reserves are included if they are applicable for your development. From there, if requested, we will look at housing tax credits, and then if needed, we will then size the deferred loan request. This method is to help us utilize one of our more scarce resources effectively, and then to help us fund as many developments as possible. Next slide, please. So technical assistance is available up until applications are due. If you would like to schedule technical assistance, please complete the form on our website, which can be found under the Getting Started tab. Technical assistance can be provided for underwriting, but it can also be provided for program design, operations, and supportive housing questions. Next slide, please. So navigating current industry issues. We would like you to tell us your story. We want to hear from you regarding your numbers. We want to understand the story behind them and the reasoning behind them. This will help us better understand your project and answer any questions during a time period where we really can't follow up with you. So what does that mean? Within your current budget, what is or isn't included? Have you adjusted your numbers in any way? Does your development budget reflect cost escalation? If it does, what is that escalation based on? Do you have any background documentation for why you are escalating the numbers the way you are? From there, are you building any cushion into your interest rates? For construction interest rates, for our bridge loans, we are seeing escalating rates. And so we are conservatively recommending that you use a rate for our bridge loans of 4.25. This rate will be adjusted at the time of final underwriting if selected. The rate is conservative and based on limiting gaps later on during the underwriting process. For our permanent loans, we do not have an advertised interest rate yet for this RFP, and we will be setting that interest rate during the summertime. If you would like to start modeling your development with an estimated rate, you can add 1% to our current advertised rates. If selected at the time of our internal feasibility review, we will set the rate to what we are able to hold during the period outlined in the second selection letter, again, if selected. Our hold for these rates is unique as the agency is taking on the risk if the rate does increase during that hold time period. Again, we cannot follow up with everyone regarding the numbers that they're using, and so providing detail either in the narrative or supporting or separate document is imperative for helping us to understand the methodology behind the budget and the amount being requested. We have the ability to modify numbers as part of our feasibility review, but we'll take into account adjustments that are being documented. The agency underwriting standards are still your best guide for how the development will be reviewed overall. Again, I want to take time to say that I appreciate everybody for attending the kickoff, and now I would like to turn over the presentation to Erica Arms, who will be going over architectural updates. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. My name is Erica Arms, and I'm one of the 3 agency architects. Next slide, please. I want to encourage all applicants to review the Building Standards website. It contains all the design and construction expectations, our rental housing design standards and sustainability requirements, and many other things. Also on the Building Standards website, you'll want to encourage everyone to sign up to receive our April e-news. Actually, we periodically send out e-news with updates, but there's a little box on the right-hand side that you can get on our distribution list. We do update our building standards at the time of the RFP, and so we'll send out an e-news with those highlights. Next slide, please. And then this is the e-news that just was published this week, and you can download it off our Building Standards website. The standards this year are very similar to last year's. They mostly entail clarifications and tips to make your application more complete with regard to the architectural and design items. Next slide, please. And then take a look at the selection scoring points that are available for enhanced sustainability. These are the same as last year. There's 5 different tiers, and the combinations of those tiers up to 5 points. And so if your project can meet the requirements of these different tiers, you'll definitely want to take a look at that. If you refer to our Chapter 4 of our Minnesota Overlay and Guide to the 2020 Enterprise Green Communities criteria, in Chapter 4, there's a little bit more detail on some of the intricacies of these tiers that would be useful for you to refer to. Next slide. And then if you are selecting an alternative building performance pathway, like SB 2030, et cetera, in those tiers, that's your building performance metric. But every other project that isn't choosing an alternative pathway is required to follow this 5.1A building performance standard. It's part of the intended method worksheet and Enterprise Green Communities criteria. And we just want to stress that you include in your application the costs associated with this building performance requirement for the Energy Star multifamily new construction program. There's requirements for an as-designed energy model before loan closing and commitment to show that it complies, and then after construction, an as-built energy model. And some of the pieces as part as meeting the energy model include underground garage ceiling insulation and exterior wall or envelope continuous insulation to meet the performance requirements. And so those are cost items that you'll want to make sure to include. And then there's some other details too with testing and verification. And for some projects, if you choose to use advanced efficiency framing, there might be an exception where you do not need to use a continuous insulation. So just take a look at the details for this building performance metric. Next slide, please. And similar to last year and previous years, applications can look at the universal design as additional selection points. You want to indicate that on your self-scoring worksheet. And then at application, you will be required to complete the universal design worksheet. And on that worksheet contains all the information about what's required for universal design. Projects that are applying for the HIB senior with the tenant restrictions of over 55, you are required to meet the universal design requirements, but you do get to use those selection scoring points as well. Next slide, please. One of the most common questions we're getting these days is about how to deal with the construction cost, material price escalations, and just the volatile market for materials right now. So we're just encouraging everyone to include the current material costs in your construction cost estimate that you submit for the RFP. And then you can itemize and call out some allowances that you're using as part of dealing with the escalation. Lumber is one of those materials, or any other COVID-related costs just include those as a separate line item in the cost estimate and call it out so we know what you've accounted for. And then be sure to contact any one of the three of us architects directly if you have questions on the construction cost issue for your application materials. But if you are going to ask other questions regarding underwriting and programs, as others mentioned in this training, to make sure to fill out the TA request form so that we can help you get a more complete application. Next slide. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Kaniski with the federal programs.
Thanks, Erica. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aaron Kaniski, and I'm the Multifamily Federal Programs Manager at Minnesota Housing, managing both the Home and National Housing Trust Fund, or NHTF programs. I want to start with the eligible uses for both Home and NHTF capital funds, which are new construction, rehabilitation, which includes conversion or adaptive reuse, and acquisition. A property may contain one or more buildings on a single site or may consist of more than one site if all sites or properties are under common ownership and common management and financing, and all housing units are being built or rehabbed as part of a single undertaking. A property must also meet all of the following: conform to all applicable zoning ordinances, possess all appropriate use permits, be used primarily for residential purposes, and provide for permanent housing. As highlighted previously in the presentation, we encourage familiarity with agency-deferred loan funding sources and project eligibility. For workforce and preservation projects, we encourage familiarity with the home program. And for permanent supportive housing projects, we encourage familiarity with both the home and NHTF programs. Next slide, please. NHTF also allows for an operating subsidy or operating cost assistance. To be eligible for this, a project must also be eligible for NHTF capital funds. All NHTF assisted units must be restricted to 30% AMI income and rent limits, in addition to meeting all other program requirements. Eligible operating costs include insurance, utilities, real property taxes, and other costs associated with the NHTF assisted units in a project. I do want to be clear that this operating subsidy can only be used to support the NHTF assisted units in a project. With that said, this operating subsidy can be put into a project with other forms of project-based rental assistance, as long as households in the NHTF assisted units are not receiving any rental assistance. If applying for this operating subsidy, the following must be submitted as part of your application. There's the operating subsidy narrative questions, calculation tool, and funding application certification. Next slide, please. For applicants requesting a Lemire First Mortgage, these are very often paired with HUD risk sharing insurance, which requires the completion of a Part 58 environmental review. Going forward, Minnesota Housing will be using a new process for these environmental reviews, in which the Phase 1 provider will now be responsible for completing and submitting all necessary documentation for the review as part of the Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment, or ESA. Due to this, we recommend for applicants requesting a Lemire First Mortgage that you increase the cost estimate of the Phase 1 ESA in your application workbook to cover the additional work that will be required by the Phase 1 provider. Next slide, please. So the information you provide in your application will assist Minnesota Housing staff in determining suitable projects for federal funding. These forms can provide key information about a project that could preclude it from being eligible for home and/or NHTF funding. So you want to make sure to provide adequate detail in the following application checklist items. The applicant's certification of known environmental issues provides more info on the environmental suitability of the proposed site location and any surrounding land uses that could impact the project. And the multifamily rental housing narrative questions provides more info on any historic properties that could be impacted by the project, special populations to be served, and whether any actions such as acquisition, demo, rehab, or site prep have occurred or are planned to occur prior to or shortly after selection. That is everything I have for federal programs for you this morning, and I will now hand it over to Matt O'Brien with Asset Management.
Matt, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Take two. I'm Matt O'Brien with our Asset Management Division, and I will explain asset management's role in the RFP feasibility review process. Next slide, please. When asset managers review RFP applications, there is a focus on three primary areas of concern: the analysis of rents, maintenance and operating expenses, and vacancy rates. So I'll briefly summarize each of these. Next slide, please. Let's start with rents. When asset managers review proposed rents, the question that we're naturally asking is, what rents are achievable for this property? The way we go about answering that question involves consulting with several different resources, which I'll briefly describe. Our first mortgage portfolio has 350 properties statewide, and every year at budget time, asset managers review rents and approve rents for the following year. So we have all of that rent data on file. And then similarly with our port system, that system has over 1,300 tax credit properties that submit rent data at least annually. And so between those two sources, we think we've got a really good deep pool of rental data at our disposal. Aside from those, we subscribe to services like CoStar and Marquette Advisors, which you may know have good, thorough information on the going rental rates throughout the state. And then lastly, our market studies. If you are applying for tax credits, you must submit a market study. And those are chock full of really good information on rents in the given market. So again, put together, we think that all of those sources allow us to make an informed decision on recommendations for rents. As it pertains to vacancy rates, we consult those same sources to see what vacancy rates are in a given market. And where the rubber meets the road with that is that our underwriting benchmark for vacancy factor is 7%. If a market is particularly hot and has been and looks like it will continue to be, it's possible that we may recommend a lower vacancy factor like 5 or 6% or sometimes even 5%. It doesn't happen often, but it does sometimes. Next slide, please. Now let's switch over to discussion on maintenance and operating expenses. When we're formulating our recommended numbers in this category, we want to make as close to an apples to apples comparison with the proposed property versus comps as much as possible. So we want to select similar building types, like apartment buildings with an elevator versus other apartment buildings with elevators, similar size, reasonable proximity, and also we take into consideration the intended populations. So we will compare the comp versus of say a 100% supportive housing development versus other 100% supporting developments, or a senior proposal versus other senior proposals, because they operate differently. For this, we rely on our first mortgage portfolio, where owners submit monthly operating data to us. So we have a lot of history on operating data. And we ideally want to find 5 comps within our portfolio that match up with the proposal. And we put them in a spreadsheet, line them up, and see where the numbers fall. If they are comparatively close, or if there are line items that deviate, we will examine those. A couple of things to note is if you have a new construction proposal and you know of some comps that you want us to take into consideration, there is a new construction comparable form that we would ask you to fill out. There's no maximum necessarily on those, so if you have a number of different properties you'd want us to consider, please fill that out. And also, if you would like us to give you a preliminary number on maintenance and operating expenses for a proposal, we're happy to do that. We would just ask you to go through the technical assistance process to make a request for that. Next slide, please. The last thing I have is regarding market studies. As I mentioned, if you have a proposal where you're asking for tax credits, you have to submit a market study. We have a list on our website of approved market analysts. So please make sure you select an analyst from that list. Also, if you are asking for, or proposing, I should say, income averaging, we would ask that the market study analyst gives tells us whether or not the 78 to 80% rents, for instance, if there's a demand for those, because we want to make sure that there's a competitive advantage with those higher rents versus what's for market rate developments. So that does it for me. I will give it back to Sarah Bunn.
I'm actually going to hand it over to James Lenoff to give us our closing remarks. Next slide, Patty.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I was absolutely paying attention to my cue there and didn't have to run back to the computer. But thank you, everyone, for attending today and for sharing your time. I recognize that it's a lot to take in, and I think you heard multiple times the invitation for technical assistance to receive additional input and guidance from Minnesota Housing staff and the expertise that they share throughout this process. And it is shared expertise because we learned from all of you as well. You saw some of the edits and changes that are continuing with the 2022 Consolidated RFP and some changes to documentation. And those efforts continue as we look forward already to the 2023 Consolidated RFP, though maybe one step at a time. Let's get through this one first. With that, there are a lot of discussions, as Commissioner Ho referenced, at the legislature, and she talked about some of the capital funding, but there's also a healthy discussion going on related to supportive housing and the ongoing supportive housing funding for services and operations. And that's something that we are actively involved with our other state partners, and I think that is also worth tracking in the larger community discussions, because we do know and recognize the ongoing struggle between planning for the capital side for construction and building permanent supportive housing, and then the need for ongoing services and rental assistance with it, that goes with that, and that's not always been aligned well. So ongoing discussions with that, including with the governor and the legislature, and hopefully we'll see some productive outcomes from those discussions. Now, this session is, our overall kickoff is not quite done. Our next step here is to move into the concurrent sessions where the, let's see, if you refer to the agenda you received when registering for the event, the links to the breakout sessions are located there. So do join the breakout session that grabs your interest. If for some reason you have a question that you're not able to either include there or if you have a question that relates to another session, certainly through technical assistance or reaching out to Minnesota Housing staff, we can still address that. So please click on the link from those agendas to attend the session you're interested in. Thank you so much for your time today. And Sarah, if I missed anything with instructions there, please do fill in the gap. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, James. So the breakout sessions will start at 11:45. We're running just a little bit early. So we all have a few minutes to run to the restroom or grab a cup of coffee, whatever you need to do. And then we will meet you in the breakout rooms at 11:45. Thanks, everyone.